Hello, welcome to another Q&A live. We'll be discussing worm farming as usual, and I hope you feel free to ask whatever worm farming questions you may have, and I will do my best to answer. Okay, so we're going to be looking at quite a few questions that are of interest to people who are thinking about starting a worm farm, or they already have a worm farm but they would like to learn more about worm farming. So you can go ahead and ask your questions, and as usual, I'll be asking some of my own. And so we're going to start off with the first question. Why is worm farming important? Now, worm farming is important because of the nutrients that the worm castings provide for the worms. It is important because of the beneficial microbes that are produced on your worm castings. Worm casting slowly releases its nutrients, so your plant always have nutrients available. Unlike other animal excrements, worm casting does not burn your plants. It is water soluble, which makes it very easy for the plants to absorb the nutrients from it, and it does not contain any harmful chemicals. That is why worm farming is so important, because it offers more benefits than using other organic fertilizers or or other animal excrement. Just need to silence this phone. Hi, Han White. Hi, Russell. Good day to you all too. Okay, so let's look at the next question. Do you need to chop up the food that you feed your worms? You don't have to. However, it is beneficial if you chop the food, because by chopping up your food, you increase the surface area of each piece. Oh, hi, Sian. Yes, you increase the surface area of the food, and it makes it easier for the worms to consume. And we're going to be discussing chopping up your food a little bit more further on in this discussion. Okay, so how can you get your worms to eat more? Well, for one, we mentioned chopping up your food increases surface area of your food. So you can chop the food, you can freeze it and then allow it to thaw. Can you do what? I don't understand that question, on White. Right. So you can chop the foods. Oh, you mean get the worms to eat more? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. So you can chop the food, you can freeze it, and then allow it to thaw. That is going to make the food mushy and easier to break down. Okay. Yes. Yes, you can actually get them to eat more. The next thing that you can do is feed them food scraps that is partially decomposing. So you don't want to feed them. You can feed them the fresh food, but it takes longer for them to eat for two reasons. One, it does not have the beneficial bacteria on it yet. So the worms are going to take longer to break down the food. And two, the moisture content in the food scrap when it is fresh is high. So when they feast on the food scraps, they're getting a lot of moisture plus the roughage from the food. If you reduce the moisture content, then you can give them more food, because the more the food, the roughage would be taking up the space of the extra moisture that they would be consuming. So, yes, allowing your food to become a bit decomposed will help them to heat it faster. And we're going to be discussing this a little bit further too. Now, we're going to move on to the next question. How can you control your worm population? Well, you can control your worm population by feeding them less or restricting the amount of space that they have in their bin. Now, you may wonder why you need to control your worm population. There are people who vermicompost for different reasons. Some will do so to get rid of their food scraps and not have it in the landfill. There are those who do it because they want the worms. There are those who do it for the castings, or it could be a combination of all these reasons. Now, sometimes you have limited amount of food supply for your worms, and so you don't want to have a large population of worms. So you might want to try to control your worm population. You might have a small amount of area where you can keep your worm bins, whether indoors or outdoors. So because of that, you might not want to have a lot of worms because you need to find somewhere to put them. The next thing is, let's see where I was. Why would you reduce? Yes. So you might have limited space. You might not want to have a lot of worms. You might have small amount of food supplies. So because of that, then you don't want to have a lot of worms. If you have a small garden, and then you might want to control the amount of worms that you use. So let's move on to the next question. Do worms actually eat food scraps? No, they don't really eat the food scraps. What the worms eat is the bacteria that grows on the food scraps. So the bacteria that breaks down the food scraps is what the worms feast on, which is why when you chop the food, it works out better for the worms, because it's going to increase the surface area for the food to break down, increasing the bacteria on it. It is going to, right, so that is why you chop it up, because it makes the surface area larger, so more bacteria to break it down faster. It also, when you decompose your food, the decomposition process takes place because of the amount of bacteria that is there. So this too is going to provide food for your worms. So it is the bacteria that breaks down the food that the worms feed on, and not the food scraps. Which is why it is important to decompose the food a bit before. And that is why I mentioned earlier that the fresh food scraps, the worms eat it slower, because when it is fresh, it doesn't have a lot of these bacteria for the worms to feed on. Okay, so we're gonna, let's see what you say here, Russell. The only thing that limits my worm population, square footage. Yes, square footage really does play a big part in reducing the worm or limiting the worm population, because as I mentioned in previous video, they require a certain amount of square footage, 1 square foot per pound of worm. So it doesn't matter what size worm you have, it is based on the weight of your worms. You need 1 square foot per pound of worms. Right, so what Han White says. He says, I give mine fresh food scraps. Yes, but the method that you use to feed your worms and white, you're constantly putting your fresh food scraps in there, but you have a lot of worms, and they are going to have a lot of food in your bin already that start decomposing. So they're going to be eating those first. And while they're eating that, the fresher one is going to be decomposing, or because of the bacteria that is there eating the food scrap that was there first, these are going to move over to your fresh food scraps and start decomposing it as well. So it work out good for them that way. Yes, true. Okay. All right. So how often should you feed your worms? That's a question that a lot of people ask, and the truth is that depend on how fast your worms are feeding, because even if your neighbor next door has the same type of worms and the same amount of worms as you do, you may find that both of you, your worms are not feeding at the same rate. So some worms are going to eat faster, some are going to eat slower. It depends on the condition that is in the bin. It depends on, so by a condition, I mean the level of moisture in your bin. It's going to depend on the temperature in your bin. It's going to depend on whether your bin is the right pH for them. So all of these things are going to determine how fast your worm feed or how slow the worm feed. If your worms are if your worms are in a confined space where there's too much worms for your bin, then they're going to slow down the rate of reproduction. So what you're going to find happening is, yes, they're still going to need to feed, but they're going to be controlling the size of your population. How much food your worm consume also depend on how many